Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, release stories, marketing stories, all the ingredients really that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of the movies and a real appreciation that somehow, through some miracle, through all the difficulties, films manage to get made. As always, I'm going to set it up with a clip from the trailer. I will come to the story, the other side of this.
This is the farm. Peaceful. Calm, civilized. But now, the only chance to save the farm is for one little pig.
He can't leave. You're my lucky pig.
To go to the city.
You can't leave. You can't leave.
Anybody home? Anybody else? Somebody! Let me in! Let me in!
He's entered a world of outcasts and misfits.
Who are these losers?
Well, hey, slow down. If you're not a cat, stay and chat.
I'm hungry.
Fleetly, come back. We don't know where it's been.
Separated from his owner.
I seem to have lost my human.
Totally on his own.
You're just a little pig in the big city. What can you possibly do? What can anyone do?
Destiny has changed his mission. And his courage is about to change everyone's lives.
Whatever the pig says, goes.
And that was a clip from 1998's Babe sequel, Babe: Pig in the City, written by George Miller, Judy Morris and Mark Lamprell, directed by George Miller, starring Magda Szubanski, James Cromwell, Mickey Rooney and, well, a talking pig. Because as covered before on this podcast, 1995's Babe was a phenomenon, pretty much out of nowhere as well. It was made on a relatively modest budget, around 35 million, in Australia by a first-time director, Chris Noonan, and the tale of the talking pig captured audiences around the world, right the way to a Best Picture Oscar nomination. It remains one of the very best live-action family films of the 1990s, and one of the key people behind the scenes was George Miller, he of Mad Max films, who we've just been discussing, but also he produced Babe and was instrumental in it going forward. He decided not to direct it in the end, as he would explain to the Los Angeles Times. I didn't direct it for very good reasons. He said, I'm very obsessive as a director. I'd have got too caught up in which way the duck was looking. And as he explained too, Babe was a pre-planned military exercise. Every animal movement was trained into the months ahead. Nothing was spontaneous. And he said, if I was on set every day, I would have lost the big picture. As a producer, I got to sit back and take a more Olympian view. Even then, Miller says, I drove everyone crazy. Now, story came out a few years ago that Miller had consulted at one stage Stanley Kubrick on how to bring the story of the sheep pig to the screen, based on the book originally by Dick King-Smith. But it was Chris Noonan who directed the film, and the film became this hit, and it was fairly soon after that it was clear a sequel was going to be required, that Universal Pictures was sitting on a lot of money. It sold a lot on home video as well, and so Babe 2 was moving forward, originally with the working title Babe in Metropolis, but well, it was a slightly different story. because it was unlikely very early on for a start that Chris Noonan was going to come back to direct the new Babe film. As he told AFR, I was kept away from the publicity from that film and I felt very hurt by that. He said, I made a huge contribution to that movie and I wasn't given the kudos I deserved. He does reflect now that people now know that I did direct it, but at the time Noonan campaigned against the way the film was credited, that it was George Miller getting a lot of the credit for the film. He would contact publications that hadn't given him due credit. He contacted the Internet Movie Database, then in its relative infancy, to get credits corrected as well. And as Noonan said of George Miller, he took credit for Babe while I watched. And Noonan wouldn't then direct a feature for many, many years. It was over a decade before he took on Miss Potter with Renee Zellweger. And by that time, a Babe sequel had come to fruition. Miriam Margolyes, incidentally, addressed this in her first book, and she said that Chris co-wrote the film with George Miller, and yet George never really acknowledged Chris Noonan's part in creating Babe. Whenever prizes were won, and Babe received 7 Oscar nominations, it was George who would go and collect the prize, not Chris. And Margolyes reflected in her book, This Much Is True, that I felt that was unfair. For the follow-up then, this was going to be very much more a George Miller film. George Miller was going to direct this time. He was co-writing the script. And also, I mean, creative freedom, he was going to get that in abundance. This was, in the eyes of Universal executives, as close to a sure thing, a sure hit really, as you could get. Because with a sequel to something as family-friendly and lovable as Babe, with George Miller involved, what could possibly go wrong? Okay, well, let's pull up a chair and have a look, because even as the budget for the sequel was set to come in at 3 times the price of the original, Universal was confident that for its 1998 Christmas film it had a massive hit on its hands. There was the fact early on that Christine Kavanagh, who brought her voice to Babe, the late Christine Kavanagh as well, well, she was keen to return to Babe 2 but couldn't agree a deal with Universal for a film that was so cash rich behind the camera. That was odd. But she pulled out of the film. She was replaced by E.G. Daly. And Miller, with some autonomy, was able to work on the screenplay for the movie and was, once again, was going to be able to direct this out of the view of Hollywood. He was going to make this in Sydney, and that meant that Universal executives were a very long flight away from the set for the film. They were, in much the same way Tim Burton got a lot more rope off the back of, for Batman Returns, off the back of making Batman. So Universal gave Miller the latitude to go where he felt the second Babe film should go. Miller duly went there. Production began on the film at the start of 1998, and the production rebuilt the Hoggett farm from the original film, this time in Sydney, and all the filming, well, it was done in and around the area. The Fox Studios complex was relatively new in the Sydney area in Australia at the time, and Babe did a lot of work there, and they went across Australia with all sorts of landmarks and landscapes to knit together the film. There are quite a lot of sights of Sydney that you will see in the film that eventually became known as Babe, Pig in the City. And this was a long and difficult shoot because, as had been implied before, when you're bringing talking animals to the screen, you've either got to train the animals or you're going to use the wizardry and the puppetry that was required to get the first film made. It was a combination of both, but the build up to that was extraordinary. A lot of preparation work was needed, and it didn't allow, as Miller had said of the first film, a lot of spontaneity on the set when shooting the movie. The animal stuff had to be pre-planned, and this time the animals were going to be moved away from the confines of Hoggett Farm for large parts of the film, and that would increase the difficulty level of what George Miller and his team were looking to do with the Babe follow-up. There were plenty of practical effects that needed to be realised here, and they were being realised in camera as well. This wasn't a case of it's going into post-production and the animals are being added by computers. I mean, technology wasn't there at that point unless you wanted rampaging dinosaurs, but in the case of Babe, Pig in the City, it was very practical techniques that were being used to realise the footage. And you know, I mean, the actors were a little more used to it. James Cromwell certainly had cut his teeth on the first film working in such environment, but what it meant was this was a long shoot. It went right the way through. I mean, it went over 6 months, I believe, through to the autumn of 1998, but all the while Miller was allowed to make his film. This was not a case, unlike Mad Max Fury Road, of the studio sending a representative to the set to see what was going on. This was, Universal was going through troubles at the time. Its big film for that Christmas was going to be Meet Joe Black, starring Brad Pitt and Anthony Hopkins, a remake of the film Death Takes a Holiday, being directed by Martin Brest, that was ultimately going to weigh in at 3 hours and was costing a lot of money itself, but still it was readying a slate of pictures that looked like surefire hits. But at this point, Universal could really use a surefire hit. It was not going through a good run, and so the energies of executives were on productions a bit close to home, and with all sorts of firefighting that was going on metaphorically at the studio. The first film, again, this was the important, this is how Babe 2 got through in the state that it did, whether you like the film or not, was regarded as an absolute bargain, a complete sleeper hit. And there was at no point during the shoot of the film that I could find anywhere that Universal realised the film that it was getting was going off in a very, very different direction. It's not as if they had a lot of time once filming was complete to sort the movie out either, that the post-production on Babe Pig in the City was swift. But on the flip side, this had been planned to the nth degree before filming began. They knew what the film was when they unpacked the cameras for the first time, and so the edit, whilst frantic, was still relatively swift. And it was a case of Miller being able to put together his director's cut, which would then be screened, and that was the first time that Universal fully set eyes on what it had spent $90 million on. Oh, to have been in that room, because the studio, which had been talking up the possibility of a Babe 3, that's where its plan was, so was it taking for granted what Babe 2 was going to be. Once it realised what it had, the panic stations kicked in. It was a location in California weeks ahead of the release of the film, where a family audience was put in front of the movie with kids reportedly left in tears. If you have not seen Babe Pig in the City, it would be fair to say it puts the animals absolutely through the ringer, leaving several of them in very near-death scenes that George Miller does not pull back on filming, that he still was able to. I think he just watched Watership Down a lot at this point. Let's go over to James Cromwell, who 2 decades later talked to the Hollywood Reporter about what it was. It just said George finished the picture and he didn't show Universal until it was fully cut, balanced print. And Universal asked George, would he be willing to show the film for management at Universal and their children and their families before? George Miller says yes, because that's the other thing. The family audience that Babe Pig in the City was shown to was made up of the families of the executives and the staff of Universal. They got in the first cut, as Cromwell said, when they go to the hospital, and he says, if you remember the picture, that's a vivisection laboratory. There are animals with posts drilled into their skulls and sores, cancers. It was, oh my God. Cromwell added, then the dog drowning sequence. Well, when I saw that thing, I thought, they can't show this to kids. The kids will freak. And as he recalled, Universal told George Miller, you've got to cut the picture. You've got to cut all of this out. And Miller responded, I can't just cut out what you don't happen to approve of, because I would have to rebalance the whole picture. And Universal said, if you have to rebalance the whole picture just to do that, you've got to do it, because we can't show that. They could not show Babe Pig in the City in the state it was shown at that first preview, and only really preview screening. Universal knew all of a sudden it had a major problem on its hands. The premiere was cancelled and the trade press started to take notice as well. Babe 2, for much of the year left alone by the press, by the studio as a surefire thing, well, now the limelight was on it and Babe 2 was said to be in trouble. Miller went back to the film and he was tinkering with the movie for just weeks before it was in cinemas. This was in the era of cans of film, not digital distribution, just at the right up to the last possible moment before the prints had to be struck and then the distribution had to begin. Miller was cutting it back, and Universal was having to bat back inquiries coming in from journalists about the film. Was this new film really in trouble? And Universal was having to say right up front, this was a darker movie in response to the inquiries coming in. In fact, when Variety ultimately reviewed the picture, the first paragraph of its review was about this to and fro, about the studio having to admit it was a darker picture. There were rumours the rumours took it even further. Was there really a sequence of pigs with wings? Were there technical glitches? Was there a dark and frightening tone? The word of mouth of the movie was before it was even hit cinemas, was in trouble. It was not going the way that Universal wanted. The sequences were being cut down. Mickey Rooney's character was nearly cut out of the film altogether. The aforementioned dog drowning sequence was cut right back. But then I remember going to see this opening weekend. That had a bit of a Bambi effect. It's a lot of the times it's what you don't show. If you make something shorter, it suddenly comes across as a lot more brutal. And what Miller's tinkering had done had not really addressed the tonal problems that Universal had raised. But then he was out of time. This was a film that was finished shooting in autumn and was going in cinemas in November. Now, the cut may have given the film a broader family rating. It originally came in with a surprise PG rating, and it's even just as surprising that it ultimately got a general Universal rating off the back of the cuts that happened. But the clues really were in an interview that George Miller had given to the Los Angeles Times in 1996, 2 years before the film came out. And he said, I don't see Babe and Mad Max as very different. Well, nor did we when we went to see Babe, Pig in the City. Miller said they're both individuals wandering in unknown landscapes, trying to find meaning, overcome a number of obstacles, reach the moment their essence is tested, and through courage effect change in the world they inhabit, with the fundamental difference that Mad Max wasn't herding sheep and trying to get them into a pen. Miller nonetheless said it's essentially the hero story told again. Well, Universal had to stick or twist, really. Ultimately, it could have postponed the film. It could have completely retooled the film, but it was committed to this release. The marketing was well underway. 25th of November, 1998, high season for family movies. It was putting the film in cinemas. It went in front of critics first. And this is where it got interesting again, because you would expect the critics perhaps to tear a film like this to pieces, but the critical response to it, whilst acknowledging that this was a much darker picture, was really quite positive of Babe, Pig in the City. None more so than the late Gene Siskel, one of the most influential critics in America at the time, courtesy of the Siskel and Ebert TV show. He would name this as his favourite film of the year, 1998's best film. Siskel would pass several months after. It is the last time he picked a film of the year, and he chose Babe, Pig in the City. There was, as much as there was discussion of just how dark it had gone, some reviews picked up that Miller had made an amazing sequel, he'd made a Mad Max sequel. It happened to have a pig in it. I think the response from critics was really quite strong. And in fact, over time, the response from critics has only enhanced. We often sit and write articles and read articles about sequels that take no chances whatsoever, that are happy to repeat the same formula, that are happy to do the same again and again and again and again. George Miller did not get that memo at all. And Babe, Pig in the City is a much, much more difficult film to take kids to. The screening I went to, well, there were people traumatised by it. There's no two ways about it. This was not the family film they were expecting. It certainly wasn't the family film that Universal had sold. You got a snippet from the trailer right at the start there, and that was a very different movie. But then Universal didn't quite know what it was selling at the point it was cutting the trailers. It did when it went into cinemas. It seemed almost inevitable that it was going to fall, and fall it duly did. 2 weeks after the release of Meet Joe Black had already fallen short for Universal at the box office, the surefire film of the year, well, it opened in 5th place the weekend of November the 27th to the 29th. Pixar's second movie, A Bug's Life, had 33 million on its second week. The Rugrats movie, the brilliant Rugrats Rugrats movie, actually. The second Rugrats movie is even better. Well, that was in second place with 21 million. Enemy of the State on its second week, 18 million. The Waterboy, 4 weeks in, 13 million. And there was Babe 2, 6.1 million. A flat-out disappointment. And at a point where people were spending heavy money on family films. The second week, it got worse. 61% of its business disappeared as the word of mouth just killed any chance of Babe 3. Stone dead. The Psycho remake came out the week after and did 10 million. That did more than the Babe sequel. Another Universal film that just hadn't delivered, really, commercially, although the Psycho remake was slightly cheaper. Then it was, Star Trek Insurrection, and Jack Frost, the very freaky Jack Frost, was out the week after. And Universal had been anticipating Babe 2, just as the first film, would clean up over the Christmas period. It just didn't. By Christmas Day, it was out of the top 10, unheard of at the point, unthinkable at the point it was greenlit. But it finished its US run with 18 million off a 90 million budget. This was close to disastrous levels of takings. Even the 50 million it had done outside of America could only bring its worldwide gross up to 69 million. And, Universal doubled down when it came to the home video release, hoping to repeat what it had succeeded with before by just getting so many sales and rentals, but even that didn't really work. It went for it, but it just couldn't turn the commercial performance of the movie round. And as a result, there were consequences here. For Universal, the head of the studio at the time, Casey Silver, he would be out of his job within weeks of the second Babe film coming out. And that was that. A change of management at the studio, and Babe 2 was one of the contributors to that. Babe 3 was killed off within a week of Babe 2 coming out. There was no way Universal was going to revisit. In fact, it's never revisited it either. In fact, if you go to 2011, such is the joy of Babe 2 within the Universal halls. 2011, the then boss of the studio was still taking shots at the film. He talked about, we make a lot of, what's that word? Bitty something movies. Every one of them breaks my heart. We set out to make good ones. One of the worst movies we ever made was The Wolfman, he not unreasonably said. The Wolfman and Babe 2 are two of the not very goodest movies we put out. And that was in an interview with IndieWire. This was like 13, 14 years after the release of the movie. There's no reason to punch down on it, and yet people were still haunted by it within Universal. That said, as I mentioned, the critical response to it has emboldened, if anything, over the years, and Babe 2 is seen as a really original and daring sequel, just not one necessarily you'd show all the kids who liked Babe 1. And let's face it, Babe 1 went to some dark places. It opens with a truck backing up to take animals away for a not very pleasant fate. For George Miller, once he'd licked his wounds, he was going to make Mad Max 4, as we discussed earlier in this episode, but he would go back into family filmmaking, and he would be given the chance to make the Dancing Penguin movie on the surface, Happy Feet. But if you've seen that as well, all the clues for where that's going are sat in Babe 2. It's just Warner Brothers did a tremendous job of selling the film. And again, Happy Feet is a much bolder film than it looks, and not quite the one you're expecting. Happy Feet 2 more so. But still, in terms of sequels to family movies, Babe Pig in the City is held up, like it or lump it, certainly within the halls of people who commission movies, as almost a what not to do. It's a miracle it got through the Hollywood system. There was no chance afterwards of a Babe film ever getting through again. If you want to financially support what we're doing, then if you head to patreon.com/SimonBrew and put some money in the pot there, you get the podcast early, you get it ad-free, you find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well. Thank you to everyone who supports the podcast that way. It's been invaluable in, let's just say, a very, very taxing year. There's also a crowdfunder running at Just Giving for Film Junior magazine, which I'm doing quite quietly, but if anyone would like to help, just really help this print magazine that I make for young film fans to try and inspire the next generation. If you search for Film Stories at Just Giving, you'll find the details of that there. Costing you absolutely nothing is if you can subscribe to this podcast if you like it. That really helps with algorithms and things like that, and is much appreciated. And ideally as well, if you can leave a hugely positive review. Algorithms seem to like that. More people seem to discover us, and I can't tell you how grateful I am to the many people who have done that for me. I thank you so much. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew, Twitter, X, whatever it is. I'm on Blue Sky too at that exactly the same username. Film Stories is on X, Twitter thingy at Film Stories. We're on Facebook.com/Film Stories Online, YouTube.com/Film Stories. We try and put audio versions of the podcast on the YouTube channel as well for those who want them there. Shop is store.filmstories.co.uk, lots of magazines, and our Blu-rays of No Way Out and Bull Durham are available there. And if you go to filmstories.co.uk, that's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features. We've got games on there. We've got TV stuff on there. We're over 5 years into this project now, bizarrely, and somehow we're still going. And that means I better go off and watch some more films because I'm going to be back soon with another episode of Film Stories. Until then, you all take care. You all look after yourselves. The most important thing is you're all safe and well. I hope you continue to be so. Take care, and I'll be back soon with some more Film Stories. Bye-bye.